You know that moment when you're scrolling through your phone at 2 in the morning, watching videos you don't care about, clicking from one thing to another, and suddenly you stop and think, what am I even doing? That moment, right there, when the silence becomes so loud it almost hurts, that's when you hear it. The voice. Not the voice that tells you what to buy or where to click next. Not the voice of your parents or your boss or society. It's the voice that's been trying to reach you your entire life, whispering from somewhere so deep inside you that most people go to their graves never having really listened to it. I'm talking about the voice of your soul, your true self, trying desperately to get your attention through the only language it knows. Your boredom. I spent decades studying the human psyche, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that boredom is not what you think it is. We've been taught to fear it, to fill every empty second with noise and distraction, productivity. But boredom is actually one of the most sacred states you can experience. It's the doorway. It's the crack in your carefully constructed routine where the light gets in. When you're bored, when you've exhausted all your usual escapes, that's when your unconscious mind finally has a chance to speak to you without competition. Think about it. When was the last time you were truly bored? Not frustrated, not anxious, not waiting impatiently for something, but genuinely, deeply bored with nothing to distract you. For most people, the answer is they can't remember. We've become so terrified of that empty space that we fill it instantly, automatically, without even thinking. We reach for our phones like drowning people reaching for a life raft. But here's what I discovered. That emptiness you're so afraid of, it's not empty at all. It's full. It's overflowing with messages from the parts of yourself you've been ignoring. Your boredom is trying to tell you something urgent and important. It's trying to tell you that the life you're living isn't the life your soul wants to live. That the person you're pretending to be isn't who you actually are. That somewhere along the way, you made a wrong turn, and now you're going through the motions of a life that doesn't fit you anymore. The voice you hear in those quiet, boring moments, it knows the truth about you. It knows what you really want, what you're really afraid of, what you're really capable of, and it's been waiting patiently for you to finally stop running and listen. Let me share something with you that changed everything for me. When I was a young doctor, successful by every external measure, I found myself profoundly, existentially bored. Not with my work exactly, but with the script I was following. I was doing what I was supposed to do, saying what I was supposed to say, being who I was supposed to be. And in the quiet moments, when I had nothing to distract me, I felt this overwhelming sense that I was living someone else's life. That feeling terrified me. So I did what everyone does. I worked harder. I filled my schedule. I made myself busier. But the boredom followed me everywhere like a shadow. One day, I finally stopped running. I sat with that boredom, really sat with it, without trying to fix it or escape it. And that's when I heard the voice clearly for the first time. It wasn't telling me to do something different. It was telling me to become someone different, to stop performing the role I'd been assigned and start discovering who I actually was beneath all the conditioning and expectations. That was the beginning of the most difficult and most important journey of my life. The journey toward what I would come to call individuation. The process of becoming your true self. The reason I'm telling you this is because I see the same thing happening everywhere I look. People are busier than ever, more connected than ever, more entertained than ever, and more profoundly disconnected from themselves than ever before. They're running from boredom like it's a disease, when actually, boredom is the cure. It's the medicine you need but don't want to take. It tastes bitter at first. Sitting with that emptiness, feeling that restlessness without immediately reaching for a distraction. But if you can learn to stay with it, to listen to what it's trying to tell you, it will guide you toward the most authentic version of your life. Your soul speaks to you in boredom because that's the only time you're quiet enough to hear it. When you're busy, when you're distracted, when you're performing your various roles and wearing your various masks, there's too much noise. The signal can't get through. But when you're bored, when all those distractions fall away and you're left alone with yourself, suddenly there's space. And in that space, the voice emerges. It might show up as a feeling of dissatisfaction. It might show up as a strange urge to change something about your life. It might show up as a memory from childhood, something you loved doing before the world told you who to be. However it shows up, it's trying to redirect you toward your true path. I want you to understand something crucial. This isn't about quitting your job, or leaving your relationship, or moving to another country, though sometimes it might lead to those things. This is about waking up. It's about recognizing that you've been sleepwalking through your own life, making choices based on fear and obligation, and what other people expect, rather than based on what your soul is calling you toward. The voice you hear in boredom is the voice of your unlived life, knocking on the door, asking to be let in. And the question you have to answer is, will you open the door, or will you keep pretending you don't hear it? Most people choose not to listen. It's easier that way. Safer. They fill their lives with so much noise and activity that they never have to face the uncomfortable questions that boredom raises. Who am I really? What do I actually want? Is this life I'm living truly mine? These questions are terrifying, because answering them honestly might mean you have to change. And change is hard. Change is uncertain. Change means letting go of the familiar, even when the familiar is slowly killing your spirit. But here's what I learned. Not changing is even harder. Living a life that isn't truly yours. Wearing a mask so long you forget what your real face looks like. Ignoring that voice until it becomes a scream you can no longer silence. That's the real suffering. That's what leads to what I call the midlife crisis, though it can happen at any age. It's what happens when you've been ignoring the voice for so long that it finally breaks through in a way you can't ignore anymore. Depression, anxiety, physical illness, sudden impulsive decisions. These are often the psyche's desperate attempts to wake you up, to force you to finally pay attention to what you've been avoiding. So let me ask you directly, what is your boredom trying to tell you? When you're alone with your thoughts, when the distractions fade away, what voice do you hear? What dissatisfaction surfaces? What dreams whisper to you from the corners of your consciousness? These aren't random thoughts or meaningless restlessness. They're breadcrumbs leading you toward your authentic self, toward the life you're meant to live. And the only way to follow them is to stop running. Stop distracting. Stop filling every moment with noise, and start listening. This isn't easy work. Our entire culture is designed to keep you from listening to that voice. You're told that productivity is virtue, that busyness is success, that comfort is the goal. You're given endless ways to distract yourself, to numb yourself, to avoid the uncomfortable truths that emerge in quiet moments. But I'm here to tell you that the most important thing you'll ever do is learn to hear and honor that inner voice. Because it's not just a voice. It's you. The real you. Trying to emerge from beneath all the layers of conditioning and fear and false identities you've accumulated. What I'm offering you in this conversation isn't a quick fix or a simple technique. I'm offering you a doorway to yourself. A way to transform boredom from something you fear into something you treasure. A way to see those quiet, empty moments, not as time to be filled but as sacred space where transformation happens. Because when you finally learn to listen to the voice you've been ignoring, when you finally have the courage to follow where it leads, your entire life changes. Not overnight, not magically, but slowly, Surely, authentically, you begin to make different choices. You begin to show up differently in the world. You begin to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. And that's what this is really about. It's about reclaiming your life from all the forces that want to tell you who to be and what to want. It's about remembering that you're not just a role or a job or a collection of obligations. You're a soul having a human experience, and that soul has wisdom for you if you'll only listen. The voice you ignore when you're bored is the voice of your becoming, inviting you to step into the fullness of who you actually are. Are you ready to listen? Are you ready to stop running from boredom and start seeing it as the gift it actually is? Are you ready to discover what that voice has been trying to tell you all along? Because I promise you this, on the other side of that listening is a life more real, more meaningful, more genuinely yours than anything you're currently living. And it all starts with paying attention to what happens when you're bored. Let me take you deeper into understanding why this matters so much. Why listening to this voice isn't just nice, but absolutely necessary for a life worth living. You see, what most people don't realize is that we're all living two lives simultaneously. There's the life you're actually living, the one everyone can see, the roles you play, and the routines you follow. And then there's the life your soul wants to live, the one that exists in potential, in dreams, in those fleeting moments when you feel most alive. The gap between these two lives, that's where your suffering lives. That's where your depression, your anxiety, your sense of meaninglessness comes from. And boredom is the space where you become aware of that gap. When you're busy, you can pretend the gap doesn't exist. You can convince yourself that this is just how life is, that everyone feels this way, that the vague dissatisfaction you carry is normal. But when you're bored, when there's nothing to do and nowhere to hide, you feel the gap viscerally. You feel the weight of the unlived life pressing against you. You feel the truth that you've been avoiding. This isn't enough. This isn't it. This isn't who you really are. I spent years working with people who came to me in crisis, and I noticed a pattern. Almost all of them described experiencing a moment of profound boredom or emptiness before everything fell apart. A moment when they stopped and realized they didn't recognize their own life anymore. That they'd been going through the motions for so long they'd forgotten how to feel anything real. These moments aren't breakdowns, though that's what they look like from the outside. They're breakthroughs. They're the psyche's way of saying enough. No more pretending. No more hiding. It's time to wake up and live your actual life. The tragedy is that most people, when they reach that moment, they medicate it away. They double down on the distractions. They tell themselves they're just being ungrateful or unrealistic. They push the voice back down and try even harder to make the false life work. And maybe it does work, for a while longer. But the voice doesn't go away. It just gets quieter, or it finds other ways to speak, through your body, through your relationships, through the opportunities you keep sabotaging, through the success that feels hollow, even as you achieve it. What I want you to understand is that this voice, this presence you feel in boredom, it's not your enemy. It's not trying to make you unhappy with your life. It's trying to make you awake to your life, to the possibility of a life lived from your authentic center rather than from fear and conditioning. And yes, that might mean becoming unhappy with certain aspects of your current situation. But that unhappiness is information. It's guidance. It's the psyche's way of saying you've wandered off your path, and it's time to find your way back. I remember a patient who came to see me, a man in his 40s who had everything society told him to want. Good career, nice family, comfortable life. And he was absolutely miserable. He couldn't understand why. He kept saying, "I should be happy. What's wrong with me?" But when we explored his boredom, when we looked at what happened in those moments, when he wasn't busy playing his various roles, a different story emerged. He'd spent his entire life living according to his father's expectations, building a life that looked successful but felt like a prison. The voice he heard in boredom was the voice of his unlived self, the artist he'd always wanted to be but never allowed himself to become. Now, I'm not going to tell you that he quit his job the next day and became a painter. That would be a simplification, and life is never that simple. But what I will tell you is that he began to paint again, in the early mornings before work, and something shifted in him. The boredom didn't disappear entirely, but it changed quality. It became less of a prison and more of a guide, showing him where the life energy was blocked, where it needed to flow. This is the crucial distinction I want you to understand. The unconscious doesn't speak to you in PowerPoint presentations. It speaks in feelings, in moods, in that peculiar restlessness that society has taught you to medicate away with entertainment and productivity. When you feel bored in a meeting that everyone else seems engaged in, when you feel that familiar hollowness while scrolling through your phone, when you sense that something is profoundly wrong, even though everything looks right on the surface, your psyche is trying to tell you something. Let me share another case, because I want you to see the pattern. I once worked with a woman who came to me complaining of what she called existential exhaustion. She wasn't depressed, she said. She wasn't anxious. She was just profoundly, deeply bored with her life. She had everything she thought she wanted: a loving husband, 3 children, a beautiful home, but she felt, in her words, like I'm watching my life happen to someone else. During our sessions, we explored her dreams, and a recurring image emerged. She was always trying to speak, but no sound would come out. Her mouth would move, but she was mute. This is the language of the unconscious. You see, it doesn't say, "You've been silencing your authentic voice for 20 years. It shows you an image of voicelessness. And if you're paying attention, if you're willing to sit with the discomfort, you begin to understand. What we discovered was that she had spent 2 decades shaping herself to fit an ideal of motherhood and wifehood that wasn't truly hers. She'd become, in essence, a beautifully crafted mask. And the dream, that terrifying loss of voice, was the self's desperate attempt to show her what she'd sacrificed in the process. This is what I mean when I speak of the unconscious as compensatory. It doesn't punish us. It seeks to restore balance. When consciousness becomes too one-sided, when we identify too completely with a persona, with a role, with what others expect of us, the unconscious will intervene, sometimes gently, through small slips and forgotten words, sometimes dramatically, through symptoms that bring our lives to a halt. I remember, she asked me, during one of our sessions, "But Dr. Jung, how do I know which voice is truly mine? I've been this person for so long, I don't remember who I was before." And I told her what I'm telling you now. You don't need to remember who you were. You need to discover who you're becoming. The self isn't a fixed point in your past that you've somehow lost. It's the totality of what you are and what you might become. The process of individuation isn't about returning to some pristine, authentic self that existed before the world got its hands on you. It's about integrating all the fragments, the persona you've constructed, the shadow you've repressed, the voices you've silenced, and yes, the authentic impulses you've long ignored. She began to write again. Not the careful, proper correspondence she'd maintained for years, but raw, unfiltered pages that no one would ever see. She started saying no to social obligations that drained her. Small rebellions, you might call them, but each one was an act of reclamation. Each one gave voice to something that had been mute for too long. And here's what fascinates me. As she did this work, as she began to honor what the dream was showing her, the physical symptoms began to diminish. Not immediately, the psyche doesn't work on our preferred timeline, but gradually, steadily. The throat constriction eased. The voice that had been failing her grew stronger. You see, the body and psyche aren't separate kingdoms. They're one landscape, responding to the same pressures, speaking the same symbolic language. What happened next surprised even her physicians. As Elena began addressing the psychic material, the buried conflicts, the unexpressed grief, the shadow she'd been avoiding, her physical symptoms began to shift. The chronic fatigue that had plagued her for years started to lift. The digestive issues that no specialist could explain began to resolve. It wasn't magic. It wasn't faith, healing. It was the psyche reclaiming its energy from the work of repression, freeing the body from carrying messages that were meant to be heard, not embodied. I've watched this pattern repeat itself countless times. The executive who develops crippling back pain when he can no longer carry the weight of his father's expectations. The artist whose hands develop tremors when she's about to sign a contract that would compromise her vision. The teacher whose voice fails when he's been silencing his truth for too long. The body speaks what the mouth cannot say. But here's what most people miss. These symptoms aren't the enemy. They're the messenger, and we live in a culture that's obsessed with shooting the messenger. We want the symptom gone immediately, completely, permanently. We'll take any pill, undergo any procedure, try any treatment that promises to silence the body's voice. But the psyche doesn't give up that easily. Silence. One symptom, and it will find another channel. Remove the messenger, and it will send another one. I'm not suggesting we ignore physical treatment. That would be as foolish as ignoring the psychological dimension. But I am suggesting that we ask a different question. Not just, how do I make this go away? But, what is this trying to tell me? What am I not willing to see? The symptoms that resist all medical intervention, the conditions that baffle specialists, the illnesses that seem to have a life of their own. These are often the psyche's most desperate attempts to get our attention, and the solution isn't always found in stronger medications or more aggressive treatments. Sometimes, the cure begins with listening. I remember a patient who came to me with chronic stomach pain that had persisted for 7 years. She had seen every specialist in Zurich. Her diet had been scrutinized, her anatomy examined, medications prescribed and changed and prescribed again. Nothing helped. The pain remained, constant as a heartbeat, demanding as a crying child. When I asked her to describe not just the pain, but what was happening in her life when it began, her face changed. 7 years ago, she told me, she had made a decision that went against everything she believed about herself. She had chosen security over passion, duty over desire. She had swallowed her truth, quite literally, and her body had been protesting ever since. But I made the right choice, she insisted. The responsible choice. And yet, I said gently, some part of you has been in agony ever since. This is what I mean by listening. The body speaks in symptoms when the conscious mind refuses to hear. It creates metaphors we cannot ignore. The throat that closes when we cannot speak our truth. The back that breaks under burdens we refuse to acknowledge. The heart that races when we live in constant violation of our deepest values. Modern medicine treats these symptoms as malfunctions to be corrected. But what if they are messages to be decoded? What if the body, in its wisdom, is trying to steer us back toward wholeness? I am not suggesting we abandon medical treatment. That would be foolish. But I am suggesting that we expand our understanding of what healing means. A pill can suppress a symptom, but only consciousness can resolve the conflict that created it. The body remembers what the mind prefers to forget. It keeps score. Every denied emotion, every swallowed truth, every moment we betrayed ourselves. The body records it all. And when the ledger becomes too unbalanced, when the split between who we are and who we pretend to be grows too wide, the body intervenes. It speaks in the language of sensation because that is the only language we cannot intellectualize away. We can rationalize our emotions, justify our choices, construct elaborate theories about why we are fine when we are not. But pain demands attention. Pain cannot be philosophized into submission. Pain is the messenger we cannot ignore, the teacher who will not be dismissed. And here is where the shadow reveals its profound intelligence. It speaks in the language of suffering times, precisely because times we have learned to ignore all gentler languages. You see, the psyche is merciful in its early warnings. Before depression sets in, there are whispers, small anxieties, fleeting dissatisfactions, dreams that disturb but do not devastate. The shadow sends ambassadors before it sends armies. But we have become masters of distraction, experts in denial. We silence the whispers with work, with entertainment, with the endless scroll of other people's curated lives. And so the volume must increase. I think of a patient I once treated, a surgeon of considerable reputation. Brilliant mind, hands that had saved countless lives. He came to me not because he wanted to, but because his body had staged a rebellion. Panic attacks during procedures, tremors he could not control. His colleagues suggested a sabbatical, but he knew somewhere beneath his fierce denial that rest would not cure what ailed him. In our sessions, we discovered what he had buried. The boy who had wanted to be a pianist, not a surgeon. The father who had mocked such frivolous ambitions. The years of sublimated rage dressed up as professional excellence. His hands, those instruments of healing, were trying to tell him what his mouth could never say. Asterisk, I am living the wrong life. Asterisk. The panic was not pathology. It was communication. This is what the collective consciousness cannot grasp, that symptoms are symbols, that disease is often dialogue. We have been trained to see suffering as malfunction, as something to be eliminated rather than interpreted. Take this pill. Try this therapy. Fix it. Remove it. Make it go away. But Jung asks, what if the pain is not the problem? What if the pain is pointing times toward times the problem? What if suffering is not random noise, but signal a message from the parts of you that cannot speak any other way? Modern psychology often treats symptoms like malfunctions. Depression is a chemical imbalance. Anxiety is overactive neurons. Trauma is stored incorrectly. The language is mechanical. The solution is adjustment. But I saw something else in my patients. I saw that their symptoms had times intention asterisk. Not conscious intention, but purpose nonetheless. A woman comes to me, paralyzed by anxiety before every social gathering. We could sedate the anxiety. We could teach her breathing exercises. But I ask her, asterisk, what is the anxiety protecting you from? Asterisk. And slowly, we discover it's protecting her from her own anger, from the rage she's never been allowed to express. Her family required her to be pleasant, agreeable, nice, so the anger went underground. And now it emerges as panic, because panic is time's acceptable times in a way that fury is not. The anxiety is not the enemy. It's a desperate guardian, doing its best with limited tools. This is what I mean by the wisdom of symptoms. They are not arbitrary. They are times adaptive. Times even when they cause suffering. The body-mind system is trying to solve a problem, and the symptom is its best attempt at a solution. Freud saw this too. In his own way, he called it the secondary gain of illness, the hidden benefits that keep us sick. But I go further. I say the symptom is not just gaining something, it's saying something. Your depression might be saying, stop. You're living a life that isn't yours. Your insomnia might be saying, there's something you're refusing to look at in the daylight. Your addiction might be saying, I'm the only way you know how to touch the numinous, the transcendent, the divine. And if you simply remove the symptom without hearing its message, what happens? It comes back, or it shapeshifts. The anxiety becomes migraines. The depression becomes chronic fatigue. The addiction becomes workaholism. We call this symptom substitution. But it's really just the psyche trying again, trying to get your attention, trying to tell you what needs to change. So I learned to approach symptoms not as enemies, but as messengers, often terrible, inconvenient, painful messengers, but messengers nonetheless. And I learned to ask my patients, what would it mean if this symptom were here to help you? What would it be trying to protect? What would it be trying to say? This doesn't mean we romanticize suffering. It doesn't mean we stop seeking relief, but it means we add another layer of inquiry. We stop treating ourselves like broken machines that need fixing. We start treating ourselves like languages that need translating. And when we become translators of our own inner lives, something profound happens. We stop resisting. We stop waging war on parts of ourselves we don't understand. Instead, we become curious. We lean in. We ask, what is this trying to tell me? I remember a woman who came to me, tormented by what she called her laziness. She would begin projects with great enthusiasm, then abandon them. Over and over. She hated herself for it, called herself weak, undisciplined, a failure. But when we explored her dreams, when we followed the threads of her associations, something else emerged. Every project she abandoned was something someone else had convinced her to pursue. Her parents, her husband, her friends. The abandonment wasn't laziness. It was her psyche's refusal to live someone else's life. Her unconscious was speaking clearly. She just hadn't learned its language yet. So we worked together, not to fix her laziness, but to understand what her genuine desire looked like, what lit her up from within, not from external pressure. And slowly, carefully, she began to choose differently, not because she disciplined herself into submission, but because she learned to listen. This is what I mean by translation. We don't eliminate the symptom, we decode it. We extract its wisdom, and, in doing so, we transform it. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because the unconscious doesn't just speak in words. It speaks in symbols, in images, in feelings that have no names. This is why dream work is so crucial. This is why I devoted so much of my life to understanding mythology, alchemy, religion, not because I wanted to be obscure, but because these are the natural languages of the psyche. Your dream about drowning? That's not random brain noise. That's your psyche using the symbol of water, the unconscious itself, to show you that something in your life is overwhelming you, pulling you under. Your recurring fantasy about running away to a cabin in the woods? That's not escapism. That's your soul crying out for solitude, for simplicity, for a life less colonized by demands. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. You can't just know what you want. You have to claim it. You have to stop living in the subjunctive mood, where everything is conditional, hypothetical. Someday, I would do this if I could be happy. When? The subjunctive is where dreams go, to suffocate politely. Your psyche doesn't reward intention. It rewards action. The symbol must become flesh. The fantasy must take form. And this is where most people stall out completely. Because claiming what you want means disappointing someone. It means saying no. It means removing your mask in a room full of people who've only ever seen you wear it. It means your mother might cry. Your boss might get angry. Your friends might not understand. Your partner might feel betrayed by the real you, the one who doesn't actually love their family game nights, who secretly resents the Sunday obligations, who fantasizes about a completely different life. Here's what I learned from decades of sitting across from suffering souls. The fear of hurting others is often a magnificent disguise for the fear of being yourself. We tell ourselves we're being noble, selfless, considerate, but underneath, we're terrified. Terrified that if we stop performing, we'll be abandoned. Terrified that our authentic self isn't enough. Terrified that the real us, the one with strange desires and unconventional needs, will be rejected, mocked, left alone. So we betray ourselves instead. We call it maturity. We call it responsibility. We call it love. But your psyche knows the truth. It feels every compromise as a small death. It marks every suppressed desire as evidence that you don't believe you deserve what you want. And over time, these little betrayals accumulate into chronic anxiety, depression, mysterious physical ailments, and that terrible flatness, that sense that you're watching your own life from behind glass. The shadow doesn't just contain what you've rejected about yourself. It contains what you've sacrificed to remain acceptable. And here's the paradox that will change everything if you let it. The people who truly love you don't need you to be smaller than you are. They're not asking you to dim your light. That's what your fear tells you they need. That's the story your wounded child self wrote when you first learned that love comes with conditions. What they're actually asking for is something far more difficult and far more real. They're asking you to show up as someone who can hold space for their humanity, while also holding space for your own. That's terrifying, isn't it? Because it requires you to admit that you're not floating above it all. In some enlightened state, it requires you to say, I'm working through something difficult right now, and I might not be fully present. Instead of performing presence while your inner world crumbles. I've watched people burn themselves to ashes trying to maintain the image of the helper, the strong one, the one who never needs. And then they wonder why their relationships feel hollow, why intimacy feels like a performance, why they can collapse alone in their apartment, but have to pull it together the moment someone texts them. You're not protecting others by hiding your struggles. You're teaching them that love in your presence requires perfection. You're showing them that vulnerability is something you accept from them but never offer in return. That's not intimacy. That's hierarchy. And hierarchy kills connection. Here's what changed everything for me. I stopped asking, what do they need from me? And started asking, what does honest relationship require right now? Sometimes that meant showing up fully. Sometimes it meant saying, I need to reschedule because I'm not in a place to give you real attention today. Sometimes it meant sitting with someone and saying, I don't have solutions, and I'm struggling too. But I'm here. The people who truly loved me didn't leave when I offered them my real self, instead of my performing self. The ones who did leave, they were never in relationship with me. They were in relationship with my function. And losing that hurts, but it's not the same as losing love. It's losing a transaction that was draining you dry. You think you're being selfless, but look closer. There's a subtle control in always being the giver. When you're always the one helping, you never have to risk being seen in your need. You never have to discover whether you're lovable when you're not useful. You never have to trust that someone might stay when you're the one falling apart. That's not generosity. That's a fortress with a welcome sign. You've convinced yourself it's safer this way, that if you never reach for comfort, you can never be denied it. If you never ask for reassurance, you'll never hear silence in response. If you never show the messy, inconvenient parts of yourself, you'll never watch someone's face change as they reassess whether you're worth the trouble. But here's what you don't realize yet. You're not protecting yourself from rejection. You're guaranteeing it. Because every time you pull away, when someone gets close, you're teaching them that closeness isn't welcome. Every time you say, "I'm fine," when you're drowning, you're training people to believe your mask instead of your eyes. Every time you punish yourself for needing before anyone else can, you're doing their job for them. You've become your own harsh parent, your own abandoning partner, your own critical observer. The very thing you feared most from others, you've internalized so completely that you don't need them to do it anymore. You do it to yourself, over and over, with a thoroughness that would make any external judge seem merciful by comparison. And the cruelest part? You think this makes you strong. You wear your self-sufficiency like armor at a peace treaty. You speak of your independence, with the pride of someone who's made a virtue out of a wound. You've rebranded your terror of vulnerability as enlightened detachment, your inability to trust as wise discernment, your desperate self-protection as admirable resilience. But I've sat across from this defense long enough to see through it. And what I see isn't strength. It's exhaustion, wearing strength's costume. It's a child still holding their breath underwater, waiting for permission to surface, not realizing they're the only one left in the pool. The people who hurt you are gone, or they've changed, or they never had the power you gave them in the first place, but you're still running the same program. Still bracing for an impact that happened years ago. Still protecting a version of yourself that doesn't exist anymore from people who aren't actually there. And the exhausting part? You can't tell the difference anymore. Your body doesn't distinguish between a memory and a threat. A tone of voice that reminds you of someone who hurt you triggers the same cascade of cortisol, the same tightening in your chest, the same urge to flee or fight or freeze. Your nervous system is responding to ghosts. This is what I meant when I spoke of the autonomous complex. It's not just a psychological concept. It's a biological reality. The past doesn't stay in the past when it's unresolved. It lives in your tissues, in your breathing patterns, in the way you hold your jaw when someone asks you a simple question. You're not being dramatic. You're not overreacting. You're responding to a catalog of injuries that your body has indexed and cross-referenced. And now every new experience gets filtered through that database. But here's what most people miss. Those old injuries aren't just wounds. They're also information. They're maps of where you learned to abandon yourself. Every trigger is a signpost pointing back to a moment when you chose someone else's comfort over your own truth. When you silenced your needs to keep the peace. When you made yourself smaller to fit into someone else's expectations. The woman who flinches when her partner raises his voice, even though he's never hurt her. She's not just reacting to him, she's remembering. Every time her father's anger made the house feel like a bomb about to detonate. She learned then that her safety depended on reading moods, on managing emotions that weren't hers to manage, on making herself invisible. Until the storm passed, the man who can't accept compliments, who deflects every kind word with a joke or a dismissal, he's still that boy whose achievements were never enough, whose father only noticed what was missing, never what was there. Praise feels like a trap because it always came with conditions, with strings attached, with the unspoken message that love was something you had to earn over and over and over again. These patterns are survival strategies that outlived their usefulness. They kept you safe once. They helped you navigate impossible situations with limited resources and even less power. But now they're prisons. They're keeping you safe from dangers that no longer exist. And in doing so, they're keeping you from the very connection and authenticity you're starving for. So what do we do with these prisons we've built? We can't simply tear them down overnight. That would be reckless, chaotic. The shadow doesn't respond well to violent rejection. No. What we need is something far more courageous. We need to open the doors. Slowly, deliberately. We need to invite the rejected parts of ourselves back into consciousness, not as enemies to be defeated, but as exiled children who've been waiting outside in the cold for far too long. I'm talking about integration. Real integration. Not the superficial self-acceptance you see plastered across social media. I'm talking about the kind of deep, uncomfortable work that requires you to sit with the parts of yourself you've spent decades trying to outrun. You know what that looks like? It looks like the man who's always prided himself on being logical and rational, finally admitting that he's terrified of appearing weak. It looks like the woman who's built her entire identity around being independent and strong, acknowledging that she desperately needs help and doesn't know how to ask for it. It looks like sitting in the discomfort of your own contradictions without immediately trying to resolve them or explain them away. Because here's what I discovered in my years of working with the psyche. You don't heal by becoming consistent. You heal by becoming whole. And wholeness includes all the messy, contradictory, inconvenient parts you've been hiding. This is where the real transformation happens. Not in the moments when you're maintaining your carefully constructed image, but in the moments when that image cracks. When you say something you didn't plan to say. When you feel something you told yourself you shouldn't feel. When the mask slips and the real you peers through. Those cracks? They're not failures. They're breakthroughs. They're the soul's way of saying, asterisk. This container is too small for what you're becoming. Asterisk. And you know what? That's terrifying. Because we've invested so much in building that container. We've told everyone it's who we are. We've built our entire lives around maintaining its shape. The idea of letting it crack open feels like death. And it is a kind of death. But what I learned, what the dreams kept trying to show me, is that death and transformation are the same process seen from different angles. The caterpillar doesn't improve itself into a butterfly. It dissolves. Completely. In the cocoon, it becomes something they call imaginal soup. Its entire body breaks down into primordial cells. And from that dissolution, something entirely new takes form. Your nervous system already knows this. That's why transformation feels so disorienting. You're not failing to hold it together. You're in the soup. You're between forms. And your psyche is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But here's what makes it even more challenging. We live in a world that worships the caterpillar. That celebrates the hustle, the grind, the constant movement. A world that sees the cocoon as laziness, as weakness, as wasted time. So when you feel the call to withdraw, to go inward, to stop performing, you feel guilty. You feel like you're letting everyone down. You feel like you should be able to transform times, and times keep up appearances at the same time. I spent years trying to maintain my professional identity while simultaneously dismantling every assumption that identity was built on. And let me tell you, it nearly destroyed me. Not because the transformation was too much, but because I was trying to transform while pretending nothing was changing. The breakthrough came when I finally gave myself permission to be in process, to be unfinished, to not have all the answers while I was discovering new questions. I started telling colleagues, I don't know. I'm exploring something I don't fully understand yet. I started admitting to myself, I'm not the person I thought I was, and I don't yet know who I'm becoming. That honesty, that willingness to be publicly unformed, it was more liberating than any insight I'd ever had. Because here's the truth. Everyone around you is also unfinished. Everyone is also in process. The only difference is how much they're willing to admit it. The persona we present to the world, that polished, consistent, put-together self, it's a fiction we all agree to maintain. But beneath that fiction, we're all just walking question marks, trying to figure it out as we go. We walk through life collecting identities like souvenirs from places we've visited. The dutiful son, the competent professional, the reliable friend, the loving partner, each one carefully curated, rehearsed, presented. And here's what's fascinating. We start to believe our own performance. We forget that we're playing a role and begin to think the role is who we are. Someone builds their entire sense of self around being the smart one, or the strong one, or the helper. They perform this identity so consistently, so convincingly, that they trap themselves inside it. And then, one day, something happens that doesn't fit the script. The smart one doesn't know the answer. The strong one breaks down crying. The helper needs help. And suddenly, their entire world destabilizes. Because if they're not that thing, then who are they? The shadow grows in direct proportion to the rigidity of the persona. The more fixed your identity, the more psychic material gets pushed underground. The person who insists they're always happy creates a massive reservoir of unexpressed grief. The one who prides themselves on rationality becomes secretly controlled by emotion. The staunch moralist harbors the very impulses they condemn in others. This is why integration is so crucial, so necessary. Not because it makes you better or more evolved, but because it makes you whole. It gives you access to the full range of your humanity. When you can acknowledge your contradictions, you're no longer controlled by them. When you can see your shadow, it loses its power to ambush you. But integration doesn't mean acting on every impulse or abandoning all standards. It means conscious awareness. It means saying, yes, I am capable of this. This too is part of being human. It's the difference between unconsciously acting out your shadow and consciously choosing your behavior while acknowledging the full spectrum of what you contain. The people who've truly done this work, they have a different quality. They're comfortable with complexity. They don't need everyone to like them. They can hold space for contradiction without immediately resolving it. They're less defensive because they've already admitted to themselves what others might accuse them of. There's a solidity to them that doesn't come from perfection, but from self-acceptance. They no longer need the world to validate what they've already verified within themselves. You know what's fascinating? The people who've done this work become strangely difficult to manipulate, not because they're cynical or guarded, but because they've already looked at their own darkness. When you've admitted your capacity for envy, for cruelty, for cowardice, when you've truly owned these potentials, then someone pointing them out loses its sting. The accusations that would devastate others just bounce off. They think, yes, I know that about myself. What's your point? This is why integrated people often seem so calm in conflict. They're not performing innocence because they've stopped believing in their own absolute innocence. They don't need to win every argument because their sense of self doesn't depend on being right. You can criticize them without triggering a defensive meltdown because you're not telling them anything they haven't already told themselves. Psychological immunity through controlled exposure to their own poison. And here's where it gets really interesting. This self-knowledge creates a strange kind of freedom. When you know your triggers, you're less controlled by them. When you understand your patterns, you can choose whether to follow them. The person who's never examined their jealousy is a slave to it, reacting automatically whenever it appears. But the person who studied their jealousy, who knows exactly how it operates, who's traced it back to its childhood origins, that person has options. They can feel the jealousy and choose not to act on it. They can recognize it as an old wound rather than present truth. They can even use it as information, asking what the jealousy is trying to protect or reveal. This is the paradox of shadow work. The more you accept your darkness, the less it controls you. The more you admit your flaws, the freer you become. It's counterintuitive, which is precisely why so few people do it. We think we need to pretend we're perfect to be loved, when actually, our pretense of perfection is what keeps us isolated. The integrated person understands something profound. Wholeness is not the same as goodness. You can be complete while still containing problematic elements. You can be authentic while acknowledging uncomfortable truths. You can be worthy of love while being fundamentally flawed. They've stopped auditioning for humanity and simply accepted their membership. This acceptance transforms everything: the way they move through the world, the relationships they build, the decisions they make. There's a quiet authority in it, not the borrowed confidence of affirmations or the brittle armor of overcompensation, but something earned through excavation. They've done the work of looking, really looking, and they haven't turned away. Where others spiral into self-flagellation or defensive blame-shifting, they simply acknowledge what happened and ask better questions. Not, why am I so broken? But, what am I learning? Not, why does this always happen to me? But, what pattern keeps repeating? They've stopped treating setbacks as evidence of fundamental unworthiness and started seeing them as data points in an ongoing experiment called becoming, and their relationships change dramatically. The people who were attracted to their performance begin to fall away, uncomfortable with this new authenticity. But others appear people who'd been there all along, perhaps, but invisible to someone who was only looking for an audience. These new connections run deeper because they're built on truth rather than impression management. The old relationships required constant maintenance, endless performance anxiety. These new ones breathe. They have space for silence, for imperfection, for the ordinary moments that actually constitute most of life. They stop seeking permission from others to be who they are. This might sound like individualism, but it's actually the opposite. It's finally being mature enough to participate in genuine community. Because community isn't built on polished performances and carefully curated selves. It's built on people who know themselves well enough to show up honestly, vulnerabilities and all. The person who's done their shadow work brings something irreplaceable to every relationship. The freedom that comes from not needing you to complete them, or validate them, or fix them. They can love without devouring, support without enabling, challenge without shaming.